again? I don't. Good evening, gentle folks. I'm speaking to you from back here. There are a couple of things that I want you to be aware of. The first is if you haven't signed in, please do, because we need a record of the folks who are here for the vote. And the sign-in sheet is out on the table on the landing. It's helpful if you have a name tag, just because I'm asking you to sit at tables with people you don't necessarily know very well. You don't have to move. But later on this evening, you're going to be gathering in your church groups, and so I figured it would be nice at this point to gather with other people so that you have an opportunity maybe to learn a little bit more about some of the folks that are making up Open Door Churches. We're going to give everybody just a minute or two more to get in. I know that you're supposed to start on time, but when I do, a whole bunch of people end up coming in late, and so I always wait a minute or two. So that's the way it works. There will be slides on the screen behind you, and it's probably more important that you pay attention to the slides than you do look at my pretty face. So. So when people start arriving now, everybody's supposed to stare at them when they come to the door, okay? You're supposed to stare at them as they walk in. Am I looking good on camera over there? All right, well, as we get ready to begin, I want you to make sure that you understand I want you to take care of yourselves. So if you have to go to the bathroom, get up and go to the bathroom. If you need a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, a glass of water, take care of that. I noticed that there are a few cookies over there, and so if you really are feeling the need, go ahead and have a cookie. It's not going to disrupt me to have you get up and move around a little bit if you need to do that. Some people I know have problems sitting still for any length of time because of issues, so please make sure and stand up. You can pace along the edges if you want to. You can lay down on the floor if that helps your back or something, but if you start snoring, we'll probably roll you over. Okay? For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Tim Overton Harris. I'm the district superintendent of what is called the Columbia District, and yes, the Open Door Churches are part of the Columbia District. Nothing else in Cascadia District's part of the Columbia District, but Open Door Churches are. The bishop has asked me to serve as your district superintendent because most of you are aware that Wendy Woodworth came out of Open Door Churches as one of your pastors and went to become the Cascadia District Superintendent. And the bishop didn't think that that was the best way for somebody to enter into DSing Open Door Churches. So you guys get me. I'm also the district superintendent of the Corvallis United Methodist Church, which means that I am a DS in 3 of the 4 districts of the Oregon-Idaho Annual Conference. There is a move on the part of the cabinet to try to get me a church in the Sage District, but I'm saying no to that at this point in time. I think I'm fine with having churches in 3 of the 4 districts. Tonight we're going to gather as the Open Door Churches. We've got some work to do as a large group, and then we're going to divide up into individual meetings for the various congregations so that you can do some specific work for your congregation. You should have an identified presiding elder who will be leading that meeting with your individual congregation. When we get to that point in the agenda, we will announce where your groups are going to be meeting elsewhere in the building. I do want to say that it's a pleasure to be with you. I think we've tried to do these things by Zoom over the last couple of years, and Zoom is a wonderful tool, and I think it's very helpful, but it's problematic when you really want to try to get an opportunity to just get to know people and get to see folks. The story that I use is a man named Daniel came onto the cabinet of the Greater Northwest area, and Daniel and I had only ever seen each other on Zoom. So, you got to imagine the little box on your computer screen, okay? That's all Daniel and I had ever seen each other by. We had our first meeting of the cabinet in person in April, and I walked into the room at about the same time Daniel walked in from another door, and the two of us looked at each other, and Daniel's about this tall, okay? So when Daniel saw me, he said, "My God, you're big." And I said, "Well, gosh, you're small." But on a box in your Zoom screen, everybody looks the same size. So it's just nice to get a little perspective, and I appreciate being here and being able to do that with you folks. We're going to start with a little bit of a devotion time. I've selected for charge conferences the passage of Scripture from Mark 2, and so I want to read that for you. No one sews a piece of new unshrunk cloth on old clothes. Otherwise, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and makes a worse tear. No one pours new wine into old leather wineskins. Otherwise, the wine would burst the wineskins, and the wine would be lost, and the wineskins destroyed. But new wine is for new wineskins. So I want to do, I'm a frustrated local church pastor. I've served local congregations for 34 years, and now I've been a DS. This is my 6th year. You can do the math about how old I am. But I always want to spend a moment or two just kind of teaching and doing a little background for you all. Normally, whenever Jesus makes a statement in the scriptures, we say Jesus is telling us a parable. Well, these are not parables that we heard today, okay? Tonight's passages are what are called amorphisms, and they are just brief sayings, statements of wisdom. They don't have a lot of flowery language like a proverb might have, but there's something that makes sense to us. The difference between them and a parable is that a parable always makes you make a choice. So when Jesus is telling, for instance, the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Everybody understands that if you're going down the road to Jericho and you're by yourself, you're probably going to get beat up and robbed. That's just what everybody would expect to happen on the road to Jericho, all right? So when this guy gets robbed, they think it's going to happen. A priest goes by, a Levite goes by. Everybody in the crowd that Jesus was talking to would have said that's totally expected. That's what you would think would happen. The third person that comes by, Jesus' audience is saying, this is going to be a good, faithful Jewish man. And Jesus says, a Samaritan. What he requires his hearers to do is to make a choice. Are you willing to go where Jesus is leading you? In this case, where Jesus is talking about loving your neighbor, he's saying a Samaritan can love a neighbor just like a Jewish man can love a neighbor. You have to choose to go where Jesus is going. That's what happens in a parable, okay? In these statements that I read for you today, it is not about making that kind of a significant choice. It's about hearing the wisdom that Jesus is offering in those particular passages. So we look at this, and is it only one or the other? Now, from my perspective, I believe that Jesus is actually offering us two options for viewing ministry. We can do patches. We can take a tear and we can fix that tear. That's a ministry, that's things that you do as a local congregation or as open door churches that you need to build on a little bit, or you need to repair and expand somewhat. It's new, but it's building on what you already have and what you already do. The other option is to do something entirely new and different, a new ministry. And so that's the new wine that's being produced. Now, Jesus offers these two examples to us, and he doesn't say everybody needs to be the patch or everybody needs to be new wineskins and new wine. Jesus doesn't say that one is better than the other or one is where each of us should be focused. Jesus is offering to us two options for talking about ministry. We can do both. We can do one or we can do the other. So I am laying before you all a challenge. As you go through your ministry conversations, as you look to the present and the future ministry, both within your local churches and as open door churches, you need to decide, is this a patch or is this new wine? And you need to make those decisions clearly understanding what the difference is. If you're putting a patch on a tear, you're fixing something and you're moving that forward in a slightly new way. If you're making new wine, you're doing something new and different. It may be formed by what you've done in the past, but it's a new and different sort of thing. The one is going to be present resources are already being applied to it, and you just strengthen that a little bit. The other is you're going to have to find new resources to support it. So as you think about mission and ministry moving forward, realize that what Jesus is offering us is not a one or other. Jesus is not saying there's only one way to go about this. Jesus is saying there are options and choices. But figure out what's best for you and for what God is calling you to be and do as communities of faith. So, I deliberately had you sit around tables, and I hope you broke up a little bit from folks that you knew. I want you to just talk at your table for the next 5 or so minutes. You can talk about what old clothes need patching from your perspective. You can talk about how we're going to shrink cloth to make the patch. You can talk about new clothes, whether they'd be better or not. You can talk about what new wine we might need. You could talk about what new wine skins you might need to develop to hold that wine. I just want you to have a conversation about ministry around your table, about what you feel. And it's not about your local congregation anymore. It's just about ministry in the Salem-Keizer area. Okay? So you have about 5 minutes. The clergy at the tables, you talk last. Okay, about one more minute. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you for having some good conversation around your tables. I would ask you to hold this image in mind as you go through the work with your congregations and as you work with Open Door churches. What is the new wine? What is the patch that needs to be developed? If you will, let's join together in prayer. Loving God, help us to find the material for the new wineskins of our day. May the faith, spirit, unique talents, and other elements of our wine that we have so long tended find new shapes and forms that meet the needs of your people and your creation in this place and time. Grant us your wisdom to preserve the essence of all you have blessed and given us in your abundance. May we be generous and generative, passing on these treasures to new folks, allowing them to work them in their own ways. Help us to be patches and cloth. Help us, O God, to shed the old wineskins of things that no longer serve us, serve our ministry, serve our neighbors, or serve your church. Grant us the courage to risk, to sow patches, and to blend new wines, trusting in you. Break us out of the brittleness that keeps us restrained or complacent. May we instead be renewed and expanded by the joy of your presence, surprising us in new ways. Lastly, O God, may this blending be a blessing to your people and your creation. May the wine of our lives outpoured be your love shared as gift to all your beloved. Amen. All right, so we're going to move into a little bit of what I refer to as required business, but as Open Door churches, you guys don't have a lot of required business. But we are going to spend just a few minutes doing some work that we need to do. We're going to start out with clergy reports, and I've decided on an order for those reports, and Kalina, you get to go first.
Wow, I'm the chosen one. Speaking of new wineskin and old wineskin, I'm thinking about my experience here with Open Door churches. What I came to is the Open Door churches, but I also have to be with each of the churches in the Open Door. And the thought that the new wineskin that I'm seeing that we need to bring in and weave that new fabric is that the open door and take it to heart as a community that we need to weave together. All the churches have a great attitude into coming together to weave this dream, this new wineskin that we have to, although some of it needs to be patches, but I am talking about to make it new. And we have all these strands and fabrics, and threads that we have used through the years, and we learn and pick from these strands the best, let's say the gold, and bring it into the new fabric of Open Door and each of our churches and our each person should have that, take that to heart and participate. It's all about in our attitude too. What I find is that there's still a lot of people who say, "What is Open Door?" And I said, there's a big difference between a closed door and an open door. And an open door is a door that is open. That's a beautiful concept. And so I just want to share that with you, since DS team gave me the first to share. That's what I want to bring into our midst, is to let's hand in hand together weaving this Open Door churches concept and community in our midst.
Thank you, Kalina. Now we're going to go to John. You see, I'm letting Alyssa go last because she's the most senior member of the pastoral staff.
That's exactly right, and thank God for Alyssa Baker. When I first got here, I was telling people the last time that I was as excited about going to a new position as that was never. That I had never ever been as excited to go to a new appointment or to a new position or a new job than I was when I came here. And I will say that my experience over the past 2.5 years of being a pastor in the Open Door Collective is sort of like, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you may remember that there's this place where Bilbo Baggins, the aging Bilbo Baggins says to his nephew, "I feel like butter scraped over too much bread." And that's what it's like to be a pastor in the Open Door Church Collective. But I do want to say one thing, and that is, I shared this with my colloquy group a couple of weeks ago, that I'm actually more optimistic about the potential that the Open Door Church, the Open Door churches have for the future now than I was when I got here, because I see that there are missional opportunities that are possible for us that I didn't really begin to understand at the time when I came here. So I am very happy that we are here in this space. I have learned a lot over the past 3 years as I've been a pastor in pandemic times, and one of the most important things that I've learned is that that real ministry can actually happen online. It may not be our preferred way of doing these things, but the number of people who have been connected to our congregations through online ministry, whether that's maintained or new, people who have found their way into our spaces because we had an online presence of some kind, is really nothing short of remarkable. So being able to help people in times like this. Bob and his team got a really, really strong affirmation from one of our First Church members just last week, Danette Barkel, who said she was quarantining from COVID exposure, and her experience of being able to worship online really was an important part of that. And so she was nice enough to send Bob a nice note for that, Bob and Holly, and those who've been a part of that. So everybody who has created this opportunity for us to sort of do, I do think this is it's both an opportunity for us to look at where patches need to be made, but also I think what I'm dreaming is of that new wine. You know, how do we create this? How do we use this as a launching pad for creativity? So,
Thank you, John. And now, Alyssa, your turn.
No, Pastor John claims that role, so that's not mine to claim. So, yes, as the longest serving member on the team, I guess, I was saying to Wendy, we all agreed what we were going to talk about this evening, and so I'm going to stick to my script that I had prepared. I'm not an ad-libber. But I feel like as someone who's been here for a really long time now, did you say 6 years? Because we came here at the same time. Tim and I changed positions at the same time. And over this last 6 years, I feel like I've been reappointed 3 different times, maybe 4. I can't keep them all straight. But in my most current role as an Open Door pastor on this team, I'm responsible for the Open Door Church Young Adult Group, as well as being the campus pastor at Morningside. And so I have 2 updates from those spaces for you this evening. The Open Door Church Young Adult Group has had to patch, just like the rest of the different types of ministries over the last couple of years. But I'm really proud of the group that has come together and the ways in which they have grown in their faith and in their relationship with one another, and in their excitement to lead the group in certain spaces. And so when I had family emergency a couple of weeks ago, they hosted the group themselves in one of their homes and did the lesson that I had planned, and then sent me pictures as proof that they were actually doing the lesson. Yeah. It was good. Yeah. And so I've been trying to help instill that in them over the past few years. They always want me to be in charge as the pastor, but they have just as much ability and space and right to lead the discussion in that group as I do. So we meet twice a month currently in person, and then everything else we do is on Instagram. So those of you who like to Instagram, you can follow us. And all of our stuff is there on our Instagram page. And tomorrow we're gathering for Friendsgiving, so we like to have fun as well. As a campus pastor at Morningside, it has been a joy to get to know the community a bit more, because pre-pandemic, I would just pop in whenever Wendy wanted to take vacation and say hi and preach in that space. But to get to know people on a week-to-week basis and day-to-day, it's been a joy to work in that space. I feel like over the last couple of months, things have just been going so very quickly, and big projects that we have dreamed about, some for way longer than any of us have been here in this space, have come to fruition with the complete gutted kitchen and re-renovation of our kitchen that is now open. And they had coffee hour yesterday. I missed it because I was here at First Church, but I hope it was good. And also with the partnership with Family Building Blocks, who now is one of their campuses is housed on our campus, and it is a joy to have such a buzz in the building, and there's always people around, which is a lot of fun. I always know they're there because we have an older building and their office is above mine, so they're walking around and doing things up there. But it is a joy to be in partnership with them and continue to figure out what it looks like to be in relationship with them beyond a rental relationship. And so our first attempt at that was to invite them to be a part of our trunk or treat. And so just to share a little bit of how that influence worked out well was last year for Trunk or Treat, we had 70 kids. This year for Trunk or Treat, we had over 500. So next year, if you're thinking around Halloween time, how can I help the church? Morningside is taking donations of candy because we had to go out 3 times and buy candy. So it was a great joy to just have so many people running through our spaces and being in ministry together. In relation to that as well, with I feel like a rebuilding of our faith relationships for our family ministries, which Tess is here, so I'm not going to put her on the spot, but later you can ask her a question if you want. But during the fall, we've been teaching faith traditions to our kids, especially around communion. So they learned what communion meant. They took communion for the first time on World Communion Sunday, and then on All Saints' Day, they served communion successfully, no accidents. Everything on World Communion or on All Saints Sunday. And so it is a joy to be working in that space and to be here as a pastor on this team in whatever form it takes. But for those who have the Open Door Board power to move us around as pastors, I like where I am right now, so let's not move it.
Thank you, Alyssa. So should I give rebuttal opportunities to the other 2 pastors, or should we just, no? Okay, I'll let it go on. One of the things that's unique, don't pay attention to the words on the slide to the right. I'm reusing slides that I use at other charge conferences, and those really don't have necessarily anything to do with you. But as Open Door Churches, you are in a unique position because you are incorporated and you do own some property. And so Wendy is here, and I'm hoping that she's just going to share briefly from the trustees of Open Door Churches. There you go.
Well, what I found since Dan Pitney asked me to be the liaison between the working committee of trustees and the board of trustees. Over there? Is that better? Okay, yep. Sorry. And so I found out really that I was chair of trustees. So watch out. So I want to explain a little bit about the structure of the whole board of Open Door Churches are the trustees, and that's the trustees committee as well. They have appointed, there are 4 of us now, to the working committee, and anyone is welcome to join us if you want, but that works on and takes care of the buildings and some of the things we've been doing. We have had 2 churches that we have sold that had closed in the time since I've been on to this. And the proceeds from the sale of Englewood are to be used for new ministry, and Pat has probably a little more information. We've just recently sold West Salem, and we're looking at what to do and how we'll manage that. The other building that we have kept that does not have a full, we have the Las Naciones is meeting at Jason Lee, but we're calling it Las Naciones. It's a very old building, like most of ours, and we have been working on some improvements that are basically health and safety, and that keeps us going, but that's a challenge also. We have, health and safety. Well, there's some mold. Oh, there's, but now we have a fire door that's being installed. So some of you don't like doing things like this, but some of us do. So, but you're welcome to join us.
All right, thank you. And do you guys still own the former Englewood parsonage too?
The what?
The former Englewood parsonage, do you still have that house?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. On the slide, though, I do want you to pay attention. How are your property and assets being utilized for ministry? So I want you around your table, since I hope you come from different congregations, you're not all from the same congregation. I want you to talk to each other about how your campus, your building, is used for ministry in the Salem-Keizer area. Okay? So share with each other the stuff that goes on in your building, share with each other the projects and programs that you do, that your facility allows you to be in ministry. All right, just another minute. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you for your conversations around the table. Hopefully you're hearing some things you hadn't heard about, and maybe your interest was piqued just a little bit. I hope that's the case. One of the things we have to realize is that we are very gifted because we have a lot of assets for ministry. Even though we might be thinking that these are lean financial times, we still are blessed with assets for ministry. And one of the most important things we can do is figure out how are we going to use those assets to transform lives and transform the world. Buildings are assets, money are assets, people are assets, relationships are assets. All of that are assets that we bring in to the sphere of ministry. And so I encourage you to think about how you're using the assets of your churches and of Open Door churches for ministry in the Salem-Keizer area. We're not going to talk about the Safe Sanctuary policy in detail. I hope each of your churches have one, that you've reviewed it, and that you are living by it. I do need to talk a little bit about the Boy Scouts of America settlement. You will remember that there were over 80,000 individuals who brought lawsuits against the Boy Scouts of America and other supporting agencies and organizations. In the process of trying to figure out how best to deal with this, the victims group agreed to enter into a settlement conversation with the Boy Scouts of America and other organizations that were supportive of the scouting programs. Part of the United Methodist Church is involved in that because we are the second largest Christian denomination that either sponsored or chartered scouting programs in the United States. In negotiating and conversation and participation in the settlement, the United Methodist Church agreed to pay $35 million into the Victims Settlement Fund, and they agreed to several other stipulations that the victims group asked us to include as a community of faith. Now, I'm not going to go into all of those, but one of them has to do with beefing up our safe sanctuary policies. So as this process moves forward and the settlement becomes final, you're probably going to be hearing something coming out of the annual conference or out of the greater Northwest area that will encourage you to revise your safe sanctuary policies some. It's probably not going to be a huge change because we already have a pretty good policy in place, most of our churches, but it will still be something that's going to need to be done. The biggest change is going to be that the victims group asked that the churches every year in their best attended gathering, which is worship, they weren't asking for Christmas Eve or Easter. But they were saying, the victims group was saying is there has to be one public place where the largest group of people are present, where you actually spend time talking about sex abuse, the rights of victims, the ongoing damage that can happen, the safe sanctuary policies that you've got and why they're important, some aspect of all of this. And that's going to be in worship because that's our biggest single place where we as communities gather with the largest number of people. You again will probably be resourced by the area or the annual conference about some things to do and ways to approach that. But keep in mind that this is part of our settlement agreement, okay? That means that we have entered into the agreement with these victims and said, in order to settle this situation, we are promising to do these things, okay? The other thing that's pertinent for you all to be aware of is part of the requirement that's going to come out is every group who uses your church is going to have to agree to your safe sanctuary policy, and they're going to have to sign something that says they make that agreement. Most churches already do this, but if you don't, you need to begin to work that in. And this signing needs to say they have reviewed and agree to following your church's safe sanctuary policy. Now, there are going to be a couple of other things, but those are the ones that I think impact each congregation in some way or another as we move forward. So like I said, the settlement hasn't quite finished. We haven't worked out all the details yet, but those are things that the victims have specifically asked of our church, the United Methodist Church, as we entered into this time of settlement with our responsibilities and obligations. So, are there any questions about that? You should know that the Oregon Idaho Annual Conference is only being asked to pay about $310,000 into the $35 million settlement. It's based upon the number of cases that were actually brought and the number of victims that were identified. And so people who are smarter than me came up with some kind of a formula to divide all that out. And so that's the way it came. But there are annual conferences that are getting hit with multiple millions of dollars to participate in this settlement. So that being said, churches are encouraged to enter into relationships and agreements with the scouting program still. You just need to make sure that your ducks are in a row and necessary documentation and policies are in place. But we're not discouraging congregations from entering into those arrangements and agreements. We just want to make sure that everybody is getting their ducks in a row, so to speak. Okay? All right. No leadership report. Pat, I guess you get to talk about the finances of Open Door Churches. This is not the compensation conversation. That comes later. This is not the compensation conversation. That comes later.
I just want to mention memory lane. If you think about in 2015, about 7 years ago, when Open Door Churches first started, the only expense and things we had talking about, is I think we were going to have about $300,000 worth of pastor's payments, and that was it. And that was like about maybe 5 checks a month, 7 coming in from the churches, 4 or 5 going out for the pastors, and that was it. And I took the job of treasurer. Well, seven years later, we're looking right now that Trinity has in the bank about $1 million. A lot of that money is from a recent sale of property like West Salem, like Inglewood, and some funds that were brought over from Jason Lee Church. But now we have a staff of our 3 pastors. We have, up until a couple months ago, we had 3 non-clergy staff. One is Mr. Bob Johnson, and one is Sarah, and the other was a secretary for Las Naciones. So we're into almost like a regular church. One thing about Open Door Churches is we don't have a general budget. We don't have a common bucket of money. All of our projects are self-funded from different sources of funds, like the communications and media people are coming from what we have as new ministry funds, basically from the sale of Inglewood. The secretary at Las Naciones is coming from the funds that they have coming from their rent or their parsonage and some contributions from the folks. So we're kind of different than most churches. So, but one thing I do want to say, and of course the biggest support that we get is from the local churches. Without them being very, very faithful at making their payments to Open Door Churches, we would not be able to carry on our functions and provide the pastor support that we have. So from the board, I'd like to thank every one of you in your local churches for the contributions that you make out of your funds to support Open Door Churches and the pastors who are serving you.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you for your work on behalf of Open Door Churches. I'm glad that you're counting the beans and handling all of that, because it's not something I would do well, so thank you. You're going to have to help me, because I obviously am a district superintendent primarily in another district. Did each of the local churches receive a financial best practices packet and asked to fill out a bunch of questions around data storage and first and second contacts and information around your financial records? Wow. Well, I'm going to have a talk with Wendy. Yeah, but so the annual conference has been asking that local churches begin to fill out a series of questions regarding best practices in financial management. I'm going to give you a scenario here. This is not an actual church that had this happen, but components of it have happened in churches, okay? Mabel has been the single financial person in a local congregation for 40 years. She has done everything by hand, so pencil and paper, all right? Mabel's husband died 10 years ago. Mabel dies. The family comes into the home and throws absolutely everything away. There is not a piece of paper left from the financial history of the congregation for those 40 years. The congregation gets nervous, but says, well, we can go to the bank and probably get some statements and maybe recreate the stuff we need to recreate. Go to the bank. There is not a living signer on any of their accounts. Through a lot of money, a lot of anxiety, a lot of time, a lot of effort, they are finally able to get back into their financial records, their information, and able to move forward. I said it's not an actual story of an actual congregation, but it is happening in a number of places in a number of congregations. So I'm going to make sure that you all get this questionnaire that was put together, because it really does talk about who's your primary person and where your password's kept and how do you back up the information and who has access to that information if your primary person is incapacitated or dies, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really just financial best practices, but a lot of our churches have not operated with the best practices in mind.
So was there a document you're supposed to receive or some link? What is it?
Well, it would be a document, but it's each district superintendent in their district was sending things out, and so we're this hybrid situation where I'm your DS from Columbia District, but Wendy and the Cascadia office was sending out your information. I just think that it's really helpful for congregations to go through these questions. It's amazing how many churches that I've had already in my district who filled out these forms who have said, you know, we never really thought about that, or my gosh, nobody knows the passwords but Janet in the office. Janet gets hit by a bus. What happens? So it's stuff that we're already aware of. Most of us know these things, and anybody who has any financial wherewithal will probably read through that and say, oh, this all makes sense. But for some reason in the church, we tend to think that it's somehow going to be that we don't have to do everything we know we should be doing. And I'm not quite sure why we think that in the church, but we do. So I just think it's a helpful thing, and I'm going to try to get that to you so you can have it. Pat, when Open Door churches at the end of the year, do you guys do any kind of a fund balance report or an audit report of? Oh, sorry. So for Open Door Church's finances, do you guys do any kind of a end of the year fund balance report or audit report or anything?
The board has not asked for that yet.
Okay, so the board doesn't ask for it. All right. Well, I won't say anything. Best practices would say that that's something that you should probably ask for, so that you have some idea of the money that came in and the money that went out and how it's balancing. So I'll just leave it at that. We are asking every local church to complete a church profile this year. The reason that we're asking you to do that is we're getting a new bishop. This bishop is going to be over the greater Northwest area, which means they're going to be overseeing Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, 460 churches. Okay? Also, the bishop is starting at a strange time, January the 1st. What that means is we are already into the appointment conversations on the cabinet level. So the only way the bishop has any hope of being able to have some idea of the churches that we're talking about is going to be able to access a profile. Okay? So I would ask each of your congregations to check your profile and update it if it needs it. And I would ask the board of Open Door Churches to maybe draft their own profile. Because it's really hard to explain you all to somebody who doesn't know you all. Okay? All right. We're going to now move into the compensation packages. In your packet there, you've got the agenda, the information regarding compensation. I think Pat's grid is probably the best place for us to start. It's the easiest to follow as opposed to looking at those forms which have multiple lines and confusing information. So, Pat, what would you like to say?
I have an issue on the voting. This is an all-church conference, right? Okay, the minutes require a separation of names between people voting and not voting.
Right, we'll do that.
Okay.
We'll take care of it.
What you have in front of you is a simplified sheet of pastor's compensation. The backup is the actual data that is used to determine this. One thing I can say about annual conference, I do not abide by ADA handicap because they can't print things. They don't get things printed big enough that I can read. So that's why I put up this here. What we're basically talking about and voting on is the first column is the cash compensation. That is the money the pastors receive in cash, and they then decide how that's distributed over about 5 or 6 different categories. In addition to that, the local church or organization puts in 13% for clergy retirement, 3% for a death and disability policies, a health insurance, toward health insurance. This is by pastor. It doesn't, each church is charged this amount for each pastor they have. And then there's always some other expenses like not unemployment, but what we pay workers' comp. There's payroll fees that go into the pension and payroll, and then it's professional expenses. So what I've shown here is the total cost of each pastor. That's the amount of total money that Open Door Churches is going to pay out. And a lot of that is driven by the cash compensation. And you notice that there are 4 pastors listed here. The fifth one, Reverend Zaida, is the pastor at Las Naciones, who is on a half-time basis, and she is paid with Open Door Church funds and some from Las Naciones as well. And she is appointed to Open Door Churches, so she is part of our compensation package. And at this time, do we want to entertain a motion by individual compensation?
Not yet. I want to have a little conversation first. So one of the things I want to point out to you on this form is you see the Health Flex line of 14.4. This is the 4th year that number has not changed. The reason that is able to happen is the annual conference has been able to keep that cost down through using reserve funds, through the fact that clergy have not accessed the fund as much as they could have, and so therefore our premiums are a little lower, and creative financing on the part of our Board of Pensions to make sure that everything happens so that local churches have not been asked to increase their contribution to the health insurance line, and this will be the 4th year that that's happening. So if anybody ever asks you what's the annual conference doing for you, you at least have one thing you can say, that over the last 4 years, they haven't raised the health insurance cost to a local church. I can't promise you that that's going to continue into the future, but one of the goals that the Board of Pensions does have is to try to keep the increase to local churches as low as possible, and where possible, to not increase at all. Okay? Now, part of this compensation vote needs to be that only people who are actual members of churches can vote on this compensation package. This is an all-church conference, so you have to be a member of one of the member churches of Open Door, okay? So you're going to be on your honor to participate in this vote. But the first thing I want to ask is, are there questions of Pat around the compensation packages that you see in this summary or the attached pages? Yes, sir. So in the wisdom of the IRS, the decision has been that housing is considered cash compensation, and then the clergy person designates how much of that cash compensation they want to use for housing. In some cases, you have parsonages provided. So like Kalina's living in a parsonage, and so there's a value to the parsonage that they use to calculate the benefits, but she doesn't have a housing allowance, then money that's put into her, her cash compensation. So it's like there's one pastor I know of that has put half of her cash compensation into housing because there's a tax benefit for her to do that. There's another pastor I know of that has put next to nothing into housing because they are then able to use cash into their retirement, additional retirement fund, which is where they want to put their money, and there's a tax benefit for that. So, go ahead. You looked like you had another question.
So is the answer that the housing is included in the cash compensation?
Yes. Other questions? You'll remember that we have a kind of a unique situation with John's housing. He technically lives in a parsonage, but it's something that is being paid for outside of the cash compensation line because your parsonage was, the parsonages that you had available were not livable or up to standard for parsonages for a pastor to move into. Okay? So even though John's housing is different than a parsonage, it's not part of his cash compensation. And we've worked all that out so it's legal and workable. But there's just a little difference there. Okay. Any other questions? All right, Pat, we'll entertain that motion now. Yes, please.
I move that Open Door Churches pays compensation to Pastor Alyssa Baker $65,439 for 2023.
All right, thank you, Pat. This motion is before you. It doesn't need a second because it comes from your board. Are there any questions? Yes.
I just have a clarification on the voting because my understanding has been that only the board got to vote on this. You're saying that any member of the churches gets to vote?
Yes, it's an all-church conference. Okay? So all those in favor of Alyssa's package as presented, raise your hands. Hands down. Anyone opposed? It passes.
I move that Open Door Churches pays Reverend John Fleming for the year 2023 compensation of $62,640.
All right, thank you for that motion. No, it's coming from the board to the body. We don't need a second for that. So are there questions about this compensation package? All right. All those in favor of approving this package, raise your hands. Hands down. All those opposed? It passes.
I move that Open Door Churches for the year 2023 pay Reverend Zia Taraka Koldar $29,186.
Are there any questions for this motion? All right, all those in favor of granting this motion, raise your hands. Hands down. All those opposed? And it passes.
I move that Open Door Churches pay Reverend Kalina Maloa cash compensation of $41,686.
Any questions? Okay, all those in favor of granting this compensation, raise your hands. Hands down. Anybody opposed, raise your hand. And you've passed it. Thank you for that work, Pat, and the board. Thank you for doing this diligent work. I want to share something with you about compensation. Okay? Did you have a question, sir?
Yes, I thought we were talking about an 8% increase or something like that. This doesn't seem to show that 8%.
Well, I don't know what your board decided to do about increases. So, Pat or somebody, can you speak to any percentage increase in the compensation over last year? Yes.
With the Board of Compensation and Equalization each year recommends to the annual conference an increase in mandatory minimum payment for positions. This year, they recommended an 8% increase in compensation. And I'm going to tell you how far-sighted that was. They probably made this decision back in April or May before annual conference. And then you realize that's the same amount that Social Security is going up. So it's a very accurate estimation of what the cost of living is going to be. And what we have done, the board has done, 3 of our pastors are minimum. But we raised the salary, the compensation of all the pastors to the 8%. And we've managed so far to get, well, if local churches would increase the amount they contribute to Open Doors in 2023. Well, I'm tell you, it's not a complete 8% in the total package. Some of those packages, things like the health insurance did not go up. The reimbursable expenses did not go up. So it's probably about a 5 or 6% increase in what our compensation is.
Thank you, Pat. This debt is represented here or not?
Students.
It doesn't appear that the 8% is in this, but maybe I don't know. Is the 8% in that?
Oh, yeah, it's still an increase from last year. An increase from last year.
Okay.
There's our compensation, and then that also reflects increases of comprehensive protection because they're driven by compensation.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for including a cost of living increase in your clergy compensation packages. For those of you that aren't aware, I am married to a clergy person. And she and I were talking about her compensation package. And I don't know how this happened over the last 3 years. We must not have talked about it in great detail. But she told her finance people not to give her a cost of living increase over the last 4 years. The church went ahead in a couple of those years and did a 2% increase anyway. But this year, she was going to them and she was going to say she didn't want an increase again this year. Now, maybe it was because it was only 2% before, maybe it was because I was paying attention this time. But I said, now wait a minute, honey. If for 4 years you only took a couple of increases, that means you're probably already down like 4%-ish. And then if you don't take an increase this year, that means you're going to be down 12% in your actual income based upon what the world is doing with your money. I said, honey, that's a large change in the income for our family. We had a negotiation, and she ended up going to her church and asking for a 5% increase. It's not the same amount. But it was just an interesting conversation that we had chosen not to have, or I hadn't paid attention. I will take the blame if that needs to be passed around for this happening. But what I want to say is there are two statistically proven things. One, clergy women are lower paid than clergy men. Okay? Two, clergy women are more apt to advocate for increases for their staff and others than they are for themselves. The other thing about this reality is churches are more willing to grant male pastors increases because they have an assumption that the male is the primary breadwinner for the family, and therefore they need to make sure and take care of the family. This is up-to-date statistical surveys that have proven this out. You guys have female clergy on your clergy team, and so you just need to be aware that this reality floats out there. Okay? I hope and pray that as we move forward as an institution, we can get to a place where there is much more equity across the genders and across the pay scales. But it is a reality, people. It is a reality. Clergy women are paid less than men, and clergy women are more willing to take decreases or not advocate for themselves in order to advocate for others. Okay? All right. You guys have a unique pastoral situation in that your pastors are pastors of Open Door churches. They're assigned to a particular campus as their primary focus. But how do you do evaluations of your pastoral staff? Huh? Does anybody know the answer to that question? And so that was a Morningside evaluation? Okay, so Morningside's SPRC evaluated Alyssa as the campus pastor at Morningside. What about Trinity and Kalina? Or Clear Lake and Kalina? What about First Church and John? What about the board and all of the clergy? Thank you. How many of you have ever had a job in this room? How many of you have ever been evaluated at your job? If you're not evaluating your clergy, both in local congregations and as a board for Open Door churches and the clergy team, you are not treating them fairly or well. We all need to have that process of looking at our job descriptions, of talking about our portfolios, of delving into what is working and what isn't. What are your goals and have you met them? Why haven't you met them? How is this going? How is it working for you? How can we support you? Those are all questions that are important questions to ask and to wrestle with. And we all have been on the receiving end of evaluations, and we know how important that can be. So please, in your local churches and in Open Door, figure out some way of doing some evaluations. Yes, sir?
Does the district have a template or a format or a form that they find useful for pastor evaluation?
There's at least one that we make accessible through the website. I can get the link to John and he can share it around. Okay? Honestly, I don't care how detailed this evaluation is. What I care about is that you're having that conversation. Okay? All right. In the United Methodist Church in our area this year, we're talking about two primary priorities. One is the future of the church, and one is dismantling racism. So around your tables, I want you to have just a brief conversation about these questions. Are things different this year from last year? If so, how? If not, why not? In relationships to dismantling racism, addressing racism. Have you utilized the tools made available to you around images and decision making? If not, why not? If so, what did you take away from using them? What do you need most to further your work in this area? All right, slide's going to stay up there. Talk around your table for a few minutes about these questions or others that might arise for you in this whole area of dismantling racism. All right, just another minute. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, folks. Next year, I'm going to be asking all of the churches that I am district superintendent for to give me a report about how they are actually doing something to dismantle racism. I don't mean another study. I don't mean another video series. I don't mean another series of speakers coming in to share with you about racism and privilege and those kinds of things. I'm going to ask each of my congregations to tell me one thing that they did in the last year where they actually did something to dismantle racism, to address white fragility, to move the needle even just ever so slightly on the issues that face us. So consider this a warning for next year's Charge Conference. The future of the United Methodist Church, God only knows what the future of the United Methodist Church is.
We do have a bishop who actually has a name.
Yeah.
You just kept saying the bishop, the bishop, the bishop.
Well, you know, Jan, when I started this thing a month ago, it was unknown. So the future of the United Methodist Church is in question. Those of you that paid attention to the jurisdictional conferences that took place across the country earlier this month, you'll know that decisions were made to elect a new group of bishops that come from entirely different places than we've had some bishops before, and some places that we've never had those kinds of bishops serving. And so it's really an interesting move that brings some hope to those of us who are observing these kinds of things. Our new bishop is Cedric Bridgeforth. He comes out of the Cal PAC annual conference. He was born in Alabama. He's the third person from Alabama that's going to be on the Oregon, Idaho annual conference. I don't know what that tells you, the cabinet. But anyway, the one saving grace is he's an Auburn fan. He's not a Roll Tide man. So anyway. But Bishop Cedric comes out of the California Pacific Conference. His most recent responsibility there has been as Director of Communication and Innovation for the annual conference. He will be moving to the Seattle area where the Episcopal residence is. He and his husband will be living in the residence, at least to start with. And the office will be at the Pacific Northwest Annual Conference offices at this point in time. It's up to each bishop to determine ultimately where they're going to end up having their office space and where they might end up living. But with the quick turnaround from an election in November to starting work on January 1, it's not going to be that they're going to be looking to live anywhere else, at least for the initial time frame. What this means, though, for the Western jurisdiction is that people are already bringing complaints against the bishops. There's rumblings out there of other complaints that are going to be put forward to try to litigate us through this process to make the church suffer, is my best way of saying what's happening. So what you all need to do in your local churches is pray for Bishop Cedric. You need to pray for the College of Bishops who are being brought up on charges. You need to pray for the Council of Bishops, which is the group that has responsibility for following through on complaints that are brought forward. No? Oh no, the Committee on Episcopacy.
The complaints end in the Western jurisdiction.
Right.
Unless the council, the global council of bishops votes by a 2/3 majority to take over the complaint. And that's not going to happen.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. I was getting that wrong. But anyway, so everybody needs your prayers in this whole process, because we're not the only place that there's going to be challenges that are going to be brought to the elections of some of the bishops that happened in the jurisdictions across the country. The other thing is we are needing to make plans to how we are going to handle various possible scenarios that might develop. Some of your churches, I think, have been picketed in the past by groups and organizations. We are hearing rumblings that some of those same groups or other groups like them might be demonstrating and picketing and causing problems around our area. And so be in prayer. Just hold all of this situation in prayer. We always hope that we're beyond it, and it seems like it always kind of comes around and raises its head. So be aware of that. We're excited for Bishop Cedric to be among us. He is not very familiar with the Pacific Northwest area. He has been here a few times to lead workshops and to do some things, but he's an avid bike rider, and so I'm going to have to probably figure out how to ride a bike again. It's been a number of years since. And I was very fearful when I was watching one of his videos that he put in there, where he was talking about one of his fondest memories of being on cabinet was when the bishop and he was on as a district superintendent made them practice to hike a 3.5-mile hike to go into a camp. And I thought to myself, if that's a good memory for him, what am I going to have to do when I'm on his cabinet? So, so anyway, but please be in prayer for him. There will be a general conference in 2024. What I'm asking you to do is to not worry too much about that. As things come out, as information is available, we will make sure and share it with you. We'll make sure and keep you apprised of what's happening. If decisions need to be made, which I don't think they will have to be made before 2024, but if decisions do have to be made, we will inform you what those decisions are and what you have to know. The thing you have to be keeping in mind is the United Methodist Church is like a huge ocean liner. Okay, it does not turn on a dime. So we probably will not make significant changes that will immediately go into effect in 2024. But we will begin the process of making some changes in 2024. What it's going to look like, nobody knows. What the outcome is going to be, nobody really knows. Now, Jan, do you want to say anything since you've got your finger on the pulse of...
What I want to say is don't worry about charges, and I think it could be that there are demonstrations, but I don't think it's likely. What I think you should think about is how to make your congregation demonstrate love. The policies of the church right now, the global church, the official policies, are just another form of the violence that killed 5 people in Colorado Springs this weekend. Right. We've got to start living a different way, whether our rule book says that or not.
Thank you, Jan. So I'm going to end our time together as the Open Door Churches by showing you a video from Bishop Elaine. It's a video that's kind of her sharing with you words of encouragement and hope and her view of what might be for the church. Now, before I start this video, I have to tell you, my kids, we live in the Aloha area up outside of Beaverton, and my kids all went to a high school called Aloha High School, and they went to a big presentation at the campus of Intel, all right? It took them 45 minutes to get their technology right. So if Intel takes 45 minutes to get their technology right, please be gentle with me as I try to get this to work, okay? Come on.
I'm Elaine Stanowski, your bishop until I retire at the end of this year. The new assignment of bishops will begin January 1st. So I encourage you to prepare your hearts to welcome your new bishop. This person will have new ideas, different style, fresh perspective, and it'll be fun to get to know who they are and to see their vision for your future and for them to hear who you are and what you've been doing all of these years. Thank you for these 6 years serving the Greater Northwest area, for your faithfulness through challenges, large and small, during really extraordinary times. I'm going to start with a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans. We know that the whole creation has been groaning together as it suffers under the pains of labor. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait. But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. I have an urgent message for each of you and for your local church as you gather for your annual Church or Charge conference this year. Wait in hope for what you do not see. Wait not because you see signs of hope, but because you trust the faithfulness of God. Actively await. Wait for what you do not see. Wait not because you see signs of hope, but because you trust the faithfulness of God. Actively await that the labor pains will give way to a new birth, to new life, to blossoms in the wilderness. Joy will come in the morning. We've been groaning in pain for a while now and waiting for things to get back to normal. Seems like forever. And there's no broad social consensus about any of the strains that we are experiencing. Let's just do a quick survey of the divisions that we're living through as a nation and a people. The United Methodist Church is divided. The United Methodist Church has fought for 50 years over God's will regarding human sexuality. In 2019, our church realized in an agonizing global conference that United Methodists who disagree about human sexuality do not want to stay together any longer. But we have not been able to agree since then. We've not been able to meet since then because of the pandemic, and we've not found a way to separate that is equitable and civil. And we're trying to divide a connectional church. That's what we've always called ourselves, and that's a messy business. So we're waiting with hope for what we cannot see. Another division. We first heard of COVID-19 in December 2019, before it had a name. As we all struggled to know how to keep safe and how to keep others safe, even in the church, we couldn't agree about what measures we should take. Should the church require masks, hand sanitizer, prohibit hugging and handshaking, singing, communion? Should we gather in person at all, or should our buildings be closed? People got angry. They blamed each other. Despite the division, in every place, some kind of unity of spirit persevered. Even when there was deep disagreement, even vehement disagreement in the church about whether the church should close the building and cancel in-person worship, during the height of the pandemic, I know that you took care of each other. You may not always have been able or allowed to keep the doors of the church open, but you found ways to keep the church alive, in touch, prayer. Wore many of us out. Thank you, good people of God, for waiting with hope and anticipation for intensity of COVID-19 to pass. And thank you, Jesus, who walks with us the way of hope in every trial. But in our survey of trials, the divisions don't end with COVID-19. Division has emerged again in a resurgence of white supremacy and racial distrust, accusation, and abuse against Asians, Blacks, Native Americans, Arabs, Hispanics, Haitians, others we could name, many others we could name, and immigrants from many places of the world. Since we watched George Floyd murdered in May 2020, and so many racially charged murders and police actions and uprisings around the country, no community is immune. We find ourselves asking or hearing others ask, do Black lives matter? Do blue lives matter? Is it a choice between one and the other? Are we witnessing a culture of police abuse, or are the police just doing what's necessary to stop crime? Is the U.S. strengthened by immigrants, or do they drain the U.S. economy and take jobs away and ruin tax social systems? Another deep divide exists around shootings and gun violence, mass shootings in particular. We've seen recently shootings in El Paso and Buffalo and Uvalde, and other gun deaths have increased astronomically. Is the solution weapons bans, background checks, gun safety training, mental health services, affordable education, higher paying jobs, increased security, better law enforcement? There is no consensus about how to turn around the wave of gun violence. And social concerns aside, what about extreme weather events? Wildfires, floods, mudslides, sinkholes, hurricanes, tornadoes, drought. Are they normal cyclical events? Increasingly, it looks like they are not, but that they are caused by long-term climate change influenced by human behavior. What is undeniable is that these extraordinary weather events are taking an unprecedented human and environmental and economic toll that's becoming impossible to manage. And finally, right to life or right to abortion? Whose life is more important? It seems like no matter where you look, there is fear, grief, outrage, accusation, enmity that spills into the streets in protest and increasingly in violence. What is true in the nation is also true in our churches. People are polarized on many fronts, holding fast to incompatible, fixed positions that they will not discuss or yield. If a church isn't divided by these issues, it's probably because one side won and the other one lost. There's a tendency among us to demonize anyone whom we don't agree with. There's a lack of interest even in having a conversation or seeking common ground between opposing views. Friends, this is not the way of Christ. We may not have much voice to counter this tendency on the dark web, or on political cable TV, or even on social media. But we don't have to participate in the divisive issues and in deepening the divides. We don't have to amplify the voices of division. The church offers another way. When we encounter one another in our difference, when we live together, worship together, sing together, struggle together, search and study and pray together, the Holy Spirit is with us. Right in the middle of a very difficult conversation, sometimes the Holy Spirit breathes transforming power through us in ways that help us see with new eyes and to love more deeply by discovering the love of Christ that passes all understanding and is to be deeper than any division. That's when the world can look at the church and Christians and say, but we know that they are Christian by their love. Differences are deep, but they don't have to become divisions, set us against one another. In the act of baptism, we let God define who our family is. In the act of surrendering to Jesus in baptism, we accept one another as God's gift to us. It is our life's work as baptized Christians to learn to live together, to embrace each other, to challenge one another, and as we share our own life stories, to find a truth that is closer to God's truth than any of us has alone. Since Cain and Abel, there's been strife in the human family. We will never be a people without strife. The Bible tells us this. But as Methodism's founder John Wesley asked and answered, though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike? May we not be of one heart, though we are not of one opinion? Without all doubt we may, he says. Herein all the children of God may unite, notwithstanding these smaller differences. I will finish my 41 active years as a clergy person and bishop in the church with deep sorrow that United Methodists have not found a way to stay together in love, if not in opinion. I count it as a sign that our divisions are deeper than our faith. And I will mourn the fact that we are choosing to relieve the tension by separating from one another, rather than stubbornly clinging to one another as one family in Christ. Some years ago, I heard of an elderly church lady who, when asked what she thought of her new pastor, said, well, I'm going to love him till I find the blessing. I'm that kind of Christian. I have so many times had my own faith changed and shaped and broadened by deep and difficult conversations with people I disagreed with. And sometimes their thoughts and faith have changed in response to the conversation as well. I don't want to turn away from differences. I want to stay in the conversation till I find the blessing and the light that it sheds. And I hope that you will, and the people in your church will, looking for the blessing of one another and staying in relationship and inviting others into conversation that leads us into deeper understanding of one another and appreciation of God's fullness and vision and promise. But as the sorting takes place, I will bless those who go and those who stay. And I will look forward with patient anticipation and trust and hope that God is walking with us. I'll look forward to the day when the divide will be mended and the fullness of God's grace and mercy will once again be embodied in the body of Christ. Weeping may linger through the night, but joy comes in the morning. Weeping may linger in the night, but joy comes in the morning. God bless you and keep you. Amen.
All right. So now you're going to break out into individual groups. I know that Morningside is headed downstairs. Is that right, Alyssa? Morningside is downstairs? Yes. Okay. Kathy Pressler's put signs out to direct folks to where to go. Who's staying in here? Trinity and Clear Lake are in this space. First Church is in the worship center next door. So please break up into your individual congregations. You have a little bit of work to do. When you're done, you're done. Bless everybody and wish them a good night. You're welcome.